In today's video, I'm going to cover the assembly of the Incra 1000SE miter gauge. I'm going to read the directions so that you don't have to. If you have any questions though, please leave them in the comments. I want to start out by saying this is going to be made a lot easier if you square your table saw's top to your blade ahead of time. Now in the box itself, you should be receiving the miter gauge, which is partially assembled, a second tape that is meant for if you wish to use the miter gauge on the other side of the table saw blade. It comes with the 0 on the opposite end, your flip stop, a ball hex key handle, some spare parts, the flip stop hardware, and then some hardware for assembling this. Those things should be in the box. If they are not, contact Incra. Now set aside everything except the miter gauge itself, the handle, and grab yourself a socket wrench in either an 11mm or 7/16 head. They both seem to fit okay, and we're going to remove this bolt but keep the washer. We're then going to take the handle and just place it right back in the same area. This is simply meant to hold this in place during shipping. We're now going to use the ball hex wrench, and we're going to loosen these two screws right here to remove the fence. Up next, we are going to get the Incra Miter HD hardware pack, and this includes this little knob that goes on the end here. Now this is only used if you have a T-slot fence and not a miter slot that just goes up and down. If it has the T at the bottom, this will slide into there, keeping the miter bar from coming up. If you do not have that on your miter slot, you will not be inserting this. This also has the Allen wrench for adjusting the thickness or bars, and we'll talk about those in a second. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to flip this around so it's at 90 degrees before we get to the table saw. So you're just going to loosen this handle, undo this knob, which slides back this pin mechanism that goes into there. We're just going to tilt it until we get into 0, and that will be at 90 degrees barring us having to adjust it at all. You are then going to grab your spare parts, which has the Allen key to fit in here. And if you need some more expansion slots or need to replace them eventually, they are also in here. Now you will notice in your box, you receive this instruction for different table saws and the alignment of different places for the miter bar to be tightened appropriately by these little plastic parts. And the way this works is it essentially screws it down to place pressure on these, which expands them. They have a little slot cut into them, and it will widen them to fit a looser miter bar. This lists certain table saws and which is likely best for those. So if you're not using the table saw I am, consult this first and then decide which of these you're going to need. Some table saws need more of them, some table saws need less of them. So we are now over at the miter saw. Mine has a T-slot, and I'll give you a little tip. Instead of trying to push this in here, go to the front, lay it down, and pull it back in. It's going to go much easier. Now you can see this is nice and sloppy right now because we haven't adjusted any of these yet. I'm going to be using mine on the left side of the blade, and this is a normal 3/4 inch standard T-slot. So this will vary, again, depending upon your table saw. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take our little Allen wrench and we're going to adjust the two in the front first. These will be on the left side. Clockwise, we'll expand them. So I've got my front two adjusted here. I had to really crank on these. I loosened them first and then I went back down, and I had to put quite a bit of pressure on there to fill this up. Double check and make sure these black ones are also tightened down. One of my screws was quite a bit loose, so I've got those tightened down, and I've got pretty good movement through here. So once we've got these front two done, we're going to now do the rear ones. Now to do this, we're going to need to flip this all the way around. We're going to remove this handle. Don't lose your washer here. We're going to loosen this up and take this out, and we're going to need to flip this guy all the way around. Now come to the back, and we have another one there and another black one there. Do the same thing. Tighten this as much as you need to get it to be snug, and double check to make sure this is tight as well. Now, one thing I highly suggest as you're doing this is double check it in different parts of where the miter gauge will be. So bring it back and disengage this back one and double check to make sure that these two are fine. Then go ahead, go all the way to the other end so that this one's out. Double check to make sure that this one and this one are fine, and just make sure through the entire range of movement, everything feels nice and stable and also slick. You don't want this to have to be your way through. Take your time with this. You've paid a lot of money for a miter gauge. You want this to be a good experience. Go back and forth, check them as needed until you get a nice fit all the way through. Because if you're cutting a wide panel, right, you may be back here. You want to make sure that this on its own is engaged. And while this isn't necessarily a panel miter gauge, if you want to cut something pretty wide, you're going to have to start pretty far back. And you need this one to be held in place on its own without necessarily this one for the beginning of that cut. That took me about 10 minutes going back and forth, but you really want to get this right and then just be able to leave it. You don't want to have to be toying around with this over time. Maybe you will at some point later if friction wears down on these at all. But once you've got it in there, you think, just make sure you can't hear it moving back and forth at all when you press on it. But also you want a nice glide through there. Now in the manual, you'll notice that for the default size, you're only supposed to be adjusting these, but I simply found, and this may have been due to rattling around and shipping, that these were just a little loose and didn't seem to be parallel with this side of the bar, so I had to play with those a little bit as well. But yours, if it is the kind of default miter size, you probably won't have to toy with these little black ones at all, but just double check to make sure they aren't loose from shipping vibration. We're gonna now bring this guy back around, make sure this little one's out of the way. We'll just set it to 90 degrees so that we can then attach the fence, and we will put our handle back inside. Grab your washer right over there, throw your handle back in. One more thing I just want to note, when you're testing the back and forth, checking for any noise, make sure it's not just the noise of this hitting up and down on the T-slot. You may confuse yourself and it may be perfectly nice and tight, but it may be this hitting on the bottom of the T-slot. So just be aware of that and don't drive yourself crazy if that is it. We're now going to reattach the fence to the miter gauge. Just make sure everything is tightened up here. And we're looking at these two little bolts on the side again. We're gonna slide it in through the T-slots and then just tighten those up, and we'll get a little bit of fine adjustment a little bit later as to where we want this. After you've tightened that up in there, just make sure everything still glides fine before we do the final adjustment. It's better to know now whether we need to play with these anymore before we set this right to where we want it and then have to take it off and go back. All right, up next, now that we've got this attached, before we do the stop, we're gonna wanna get this whole thing set to 90 degrees. Now, ideally, this comes out of the box at 90 degrees. Mine was not, mine was a little off. This is a few days later, and I'll fill you in on why now. But to set this to 90 degrees, if it's not, first, start with your most trusted square, whether that's an engineer square, combo square, whatever it is. Bring your blade up and try to get it right up along a tooth in the front and in the back. Ideally, it's long enough for that, or straight in the middle if your square is small enough between the teeth. Either way, however you check it, do that. You're gonna then wanna make a test cut if you think it's close. If it is not close, you're gonna need a Phillips head screwdriver, and there are 3 screws in here. There's essentially a pivot and then 2 outside ones. Loosening these loosens this front mechanism, which the fence is attached to, and allows it to pivot either way. So let's say you've made a test cut and we've got a gap in the front, meaning your square is kind of like up like this. You're gonna need to loosen these 3. Don't loosen the middle one as much as the other ones. It can pivot easier. And you're gonna wanna push this front side a little bit forward. If you have a gap in the front, it needs to pivot this way. If you have a gap in the back, if you're square, this is exaggerated, of course, looks like this. If you're seeing light in the back here, it needs to come the other way. That's the simplest way I can explain. So as you play with this, every time you adjust it, tighten these down with the Phillips head, make a test cut, try it again if you're not there. Ideally, again, this is why I talked about having your tabletop square out of the box, or to start, it's square to your blade so that anything here, if it is already square out of the box, you're good to go. Mine was a little bit off, just enough that over, 10 inches or so, I was getting a little front gap, so I adjusted it. Everything's good now. Still moves nicely. It's nice and solid in there. Just make sure to get that done now so that you never have to worry about it again. And don't forget to tighten these 3 down, all of them afterwards. Don't forget this guy in the middle here. Now, once you've got this entire fence square to the blade, you're gonna wanna take your square and you're gonna wanna check for the squareness vertical to the table. this entire thing can be adjusted back and forth using these 4 nuts right here. Now, essentially, they kind of push and pull it up and down. If you want to go forward, then you have to turn these inner nuts counterclockwise, and you're going to need to loosen the other ones up just a little bit so that it can move. If you're wanting to go backwards, or what we'll call backwards, you're going to need to turn these nuts the opposite way, clockwise. It's essentially like this pivoting mechanism using these nuts. And when I was setting mine up, it's a little finicky and it takes a few checks, but you'll eventually get the hang of it. And then make sure you've got them locked up against each other afterwards so that it's not flopping back and forth. But to go forwards, you got to go counterclockwise on these guys. To go backwards, you got to go clockwise on these guys, and it will push it back and forth like that. Do a final check and you should be good to go there. So at this point, we really just have 2 things left to do: putting the stop on and then adjusting this back and forth. Now, we're going to start with the adjustment of this, and I want to say this very specifically. If you have a SawStop, this can absolutely never touch this blade. If it touches this blade, the brake will trip. I have evidence that this blade will trip, or this brake will trip if you touch this. The manual suggests pushing this all the way up against the teeth, essentially, so that you get a 0 inch, 0 whatever. It's right up against the blade. Then this little thing on top, the measuring thing, matches up. Just don't do it. Just don't do it, because if you are off at all and it makes contact or the blade vibrates for whatever reason, it will trip this. I set mine right up against there, went to make my first cut, and boom, just like that, I tripped it. So I highly suggest setting this off of the blade, even just a little bit. And what you can do is, with the saw on but not running, you can go down and you can look at the power button as you push this back and forth. And if it ever blinks red, that means there would have been a contact that tripped it. For everyone else, however, you are going to loosen this, and for SawStop people too, but you're going to loosen these 2 bolts right here, and that will loosen this entire mechanism. It's like a T-track, and you're going to slide it up. If you want to do the calibration based on the manual and using this scale, you will go right up to the teeth of the blade. Again, if you're using a SawStop, do not do this. And once you've moved it over, just lock it back in. And do not forget that whenever you're changing angle, you're going to have to change where this is. It's either going to need to be closer or farther, because it will change the distance the fence is from the blade. Now, for those of you who are using a non-SawStop saw, if this is directly up against the blade, this should be calibrated in as long as it is up against the end. This little guy in here just floats. It's got a kind of a bar underneath, and it's kind of bent in there a little bit so that it doesn't move. But you can move this little measuring line back and forth in there. Some people like that, some people hate that. And then the final thing after that is we have the flip stop. And this is why this is being filmed a few days later. When I got mine, and I didn't realize this for a while until I was into the setup, it did not come with these white knobs. I had to contact Incra, and they got back to me by the next day, and they shipped them out. And I think it was about 4 or 5 days. I got these 2 white knobs. So if you're going through and setting this up and you're thinking, how do I attach this thing? Make sure you've got these 2 white knobs, because if you're missing them, you can't. I will also point out that when you get this flip stop, it's quite tight. It's tight enough to the point that when I first got mine, I was trying to figure out how to loosen this. Well, it's probably not loose, or it's probably not stuck. It's just got some compound inside of here to make sure it doesn't just kind of wiggle around, and it's tightened just right so that you still can move it, but it's not going to flop back and forth. So just be aware that it's probably not stuck. It probably is just tight on there because it's never been moved. Now, the way this works is that this black bar here and these black bars here have a bunch of little ridges, and these knobs push in to pull this back, locking it into these little ridges. It's a very good, sturdy system. It allows for very fine adjustment. We also have a micro adjuster, and when I do my full review, I'll go over in detail more of those things. This is just a setup, how to get it working out of the box so you can get to cutting. These do flip up independently. These are just little bolts in there that this bar can slide in and out. You will have received 2 small ones so that you can do separate cuts on the same piece of wood without having to change the positioning by using those as double stops. Make sure when you're going to put this on that this is flush with this outside of this red one, or else you'll be lining up the top if you are going to use the measuring system, but it will be jutting out a little bit. Now, one thing I want to point out with the flip stop when you're using it is that when you're going to move it on there, it can pretty easily come off. There's kind of a right amount of tension to have on these little knobs so that it slides, but you're going to have to push it forward when you want to slide it, or else it's going to stick in those teeth. So let's say you loosen it and you want to move it, you're going to have to push forward, then pull it in and lock it down. You get used to it pretty quickly. It's a little awkward at first, and obviously this also rides in these slots here. Now, for those of you who are like me and you have a SawStop, or if in general you just do not want to keep this thing anywhere close enough to the blade that you could accidentally hit it, well, that causes a little problem in your measuring tape. Using their method when you have it directly up against the blade and slightly adjusting the position of this, that works pretty well. But because I'm going to have a little over a 1/16 between there, I start to run into problems with moving this thing around. So what my simple solution was is to use the micro adjust and movement method on this red part. It moves in a micro adjustable system using this to essentially offset this such that the edge of this now placed over and where I would see it is offset by the same amount from the blade, so that when I pick a spot and want to align it visually with the end of this, it is accounting for that offset and I can actually use this little measuring system. So we're going to take a piece of wood. There's no need to make it really long or anything. We're going to pick a measurement. It doesn't matter what it is, just make sure you mark it accurately. I'm just going to do 4 3/4 here. We're going to do 4 3/4. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to line that up with the blade. And now I know that wherever the end of this is, that is going to be 4 3/4. Okay, easy enough. We're going to grab this little hex ball wrench. On the stop, you will see this screw sticking out of the end, this bolt, and these two bolts right here. Now, when you loosen these two, that allows this red part to adjust on its own, and you can lock this gold part down and move the red part independently. So I'd like to be able to use my eye off of the edge of this gold part here to line up with this measuring mark. So what I'll do is I'll just set it at, what was my thing, right on the edge here at 4 3/4. And now I've already set this, I just forgot to film it the first time. So then what I would do is, this is probably going to be off. It's probably going to move your piece this way, or it's not going to be far enough. You're going to loosen these two back screws on the back of this while this is locked in with the edge of this over the dimension that you want. And make sure when you tighten this that it doesn't move at all. One of the things that the gripping mechanism, I don't say it's a problem, but it has to line up so that they slot together. And if you're not on the slots, it can shift a little bit. So just double check and make sure you're lined up. And then you would have loosened these top ones here. You will then take your piece and you will line it up correctly as you wish to cut. And then you will use this to move this red piece independently such that the gold part on the stop matches the measurement you want. And now you're adjusting this to kick in or out this red part so that it lines up with your cut. So let's say my piece was too far away. I would loosen this up, and then I would slightly loosen this little clear plastic nut right here so we can get some movement easier, and we'll tighten that down at the end. And then to move this to the right, you will turn this clockwise and it will push this, or to move it to the left, you will loosen it and then you'll manually have to move this over. When you get it so that your mark is exactly at the distance that you have matched this up, you will then lock this down at a little positive tension just to make sure it's set, and you will then have calculated for the offset. The one downside of this is that it obviously doesn't translate if you have to move this gold bar at all, which you occasionally do if you're changing angles. So it's kind of useful if you're doing mostly just 90-degree cutting, but it's going to become not useful if you have to change where this aluminum gold bar is relative to the miter gauge itself. It's not a perfect solution, but if you're like me and you're mainly using this for 90 degrees, it's going to help you so that you can actually use this measuring tape while keeping this at a safe distance from this blade at all so that you never trip the brake on the SawStop. And the final thing we're going to cover then to wrap this up is that to extend this arm, you simply loosen this guy up. It comes out. Be careful, you will pull it out too far and it will come right out. And to swap sides, you simply pull this all the way out. You undo these two. You need to take this and move it over to this guy, and then you'll need to move this over to the other end. That's all you need to do to be able to use this on the other side of the table saw. It's real simple. It's really quick. You just pull this out, take this mounting hardware right over to there, and you're good to go. Everything except the flip stop movement is controlled using this hex key wrench. It's really nice. Some people don't like this, and the Incra does sell little flip switches for like an extra 30 bucks. It'd be great if they came with it. It doesn't, but they sell things so that you don't have to use this little tool when you want to adjust it. Though I found as long as you keep it close, it's quite quick. And that's going to finish our short tutorial on setting up the Incra 1000 SE. Hopefully you've got everything done by now. I'm going to do a review eventually once I've used this enough, maybe over a couple weeks, a month, to really get the hang of it, find out what I like, what I dislike. All I can say is that if you are using a SawStop, do not use this and let this touch the blade at all while it's running, or you will be out a nice $100. Thanks for joining me today. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that. Have a good one.